Hello everybody, welcome back to SketchyGOichie. I'm your humble host, Roger Andrews, illustrator, graphic designer, character designer, and character cultivator, I guess, in this case. I certainly did not create Spider-Man, not even close. You could thank Stan Lee and Steve Ditko for that back in the 60s. However, I have drawn him quite a few times over the years in my capacity as kind of an illustrator at large over at Hasbro. They've had that Marvel property for many years now, and I've been very blessed to have rendered Spider-Man in just about every conceivable configuration you can imagine. Hence, there's my hints for the day. This particular video, which is essentially me sharing my process, my character sketching process, and more importantly, the character pose process. Because obviously Spider-Man, if anyone, I'm assuming everyone's initiated who Spider-Man is by now. There's been like a zillion movies with the origin story and everything, but he's a living spider, or a humanoid version of a spider, for lack of a better way to describe it. And so there's a quality that a lot of comic book artists over the years have sort of exhibited his sort of insect-like traits in how they render his pose. So what you're seeing here is me just doing a series of very loose gesture sketches, thumbnail sketches, if you will. And it's the main reason why I wanted to post this video in particular. It's the process that I think any artist who is looking to really sort of be creative with whatever image they're rendering, but particularly when you're drawing, comic book characters, you should probably kind of play around with different poses and try to make them as dynamic as possible. And clearly that's what I'm trying to go for here. And that's why there are a series of these. And, I think I netted out with like 20 different versions of Spider-Man. And as you can see, he's very stylized. These are less pure comic book, meaning, less realistic proportions, if you can say realism in a comic book. By that I mean anatomically, the proportions are a little more toyetic. And so, and the definition of that would probably be, something that you would, you would buy as a toy, as an action figure, and, slightly larger head, smaller torso. Sometimes I've rendered characters over the years with enormous heads and little chunky bodies. I've also done them with, modestly larger heads, but the body proportions are skewed. It's the only really way to describe it. And it just, there's kind of a formula. I don't know if it's ever been written down. I assume somewhere, somebody at Mattel or Hasbro or somewhere else has kind of gotten a formula on how large to do the heads in relation to the bodies, to make it sort of the most appealing to kids and their parents when buying figures and buying toys. I don't know what that formula is. I just kind of instinctively render them in a certain way, and luckily for me, over the years, my clients have been pretty happy with those proportions, or they've directed me in how far to push all these proportions. So moving along, as you can see, again, I think the number netted out at 20, and the whole purpose of me doing so many of them, well, actually, to be honest, my intent was to do 3 or 4 different poses, and once I found the one I like, I was gonna do a tighter ink line rendering over. There's ones that flash in and out because I literally just super quickly rendered them. But ultimately, the point of this was I just really wanted to do a Spider-Man piece in advance of the Far From Home movie that's coming out this week being July 4th. Today is the 1st of July. Happy summer, everybody who's in a hemisphere that's feeling summer right now. And so it's really just, Far From Home, my intent was to, I don't think I've rendered Spider-Man in his too many times in his Far From Home gear, where it's got a lot of the dark shapes on his arm and legs, and it's not the purely traditional Spider-Man costume that we've seen in comic books and cartoons and over the years, and even in some of the films. So I was going to play around with, actually let me do a Spider-Man in that costume. And then I just kind of went off on a tangent. And it's this part, I got to be honest with you guys, is the most fun part for me when it comes to rendering. It's the creation of the poses and working with a licensed character or inventing my own characters from scratch. This is to me where the creativity is, where you get a lot of the energy and a lot of the dynamics. And in this case, I'm playing around with proportions. As you can see, like I've started doing ones that are a little more squat in size, a little more superhero squad, which is a product line I worked on many moons ago. And those familiar with the toys or collect the toys, I did a ton of the preliminary sketches for the packaging art. And so I kind of got known for doing that for a while. I would go to comic book conventions and do sketches all days, and I would sell prints of stuff that was in that style, my own characters or characters that were similar in that sort of like enormous head and feet and hands and these little tiny bodies. And then at some point I decided to try to do ones with these, again, keep maintaining that enormous head, but with smaller hands and feet. And I played with ones that are a little more kind of like the pop figure, the Funko Pops. I played around with that, with the massive head and the little teeny body, kind of that urban vinyl character feel. That's what this one kind of represents. And I like it actually. It's a little tricky to make a dynamic character pose out of that, because you don't have a lot of body to work with. Again, the head, Spider-Man's head, and thank you to Steve Ditko. That head design is so great, with the big eyes and the black that sort of rims the shape of the eyes, and and the head and the webbing and all that is great. The design of that is great, and it's really iconic. I literally could just draw a Spider-Man head on the screen and you guys would recognize it immediately. And that was before any of these amazingly successful Marvel movies came out in the last couple of decades. But the reality is, if you don't have enough body to work with, it's really difficult to get a dynamic pose. What happens to me, in order to get a dynamic pose, I adjust the camera angle. Imagine if you were shooting this with your iPhone and you're shooting a figure, an actual toy figure, and you place it on the floor and you shoot down at it. And that's kind of that down angle, what we call a God's eye POV, God's eye point of view. Or if you set it on the table and kind of squat down below the table and shoot up at the character, that's actually the God's eye point of view. The reverse is the bird's eye, which is when you shoot from above down. So forgive me for that little adjustment. I do these in one take, by the way, so if you wonder why I always leave in the mistakes and the errors, I think it's a little more natural, a little more real for you guys to hear my kind of stream of consciousness, along with all the errors that come with that. But anyway, so God's eye is sort of looking, down. Bird's eye is very similar to that. Forget it. You know what? Google God's eye, Google bird's eye. I think you'll figure it out. So back to the show. So I think I'm actually at a point now where I'm really starting to dial in the style that I want to go with. I want a more elongated style. I want an edgy, like sharper. By that, a little more faceted looking, like shapes. By that I mean like corners that end in a point rather than ending in rounded. You can even see there with the eyes on his mask, where I sort of made them sort of sharp and edgy. I was like, all right, I think I was coming up with something. I think I was actually really dialing in the direction I wanted to go with it. And this is just me kind of indicating the very, very loosely indicating the details of the costume. Obviously, there's no point in me going in and really detailing out all the webs and all that stuff at this point. It's not necessary. And of course, I was kind of playing with a kind of an outline shape, something that sort of makes it, gives it sort of a nice dynamic, like this sort of swirl pattern that I was kind of creating with those webs. I thought it would have kind of been an interesting thing, like you released the web and it just kind of left this by release, I mean he's leaping in the air and he let go of it. And he's about to be projected forward, but the webs, kind of remain in the background. So that's me kind of monkeying around with that and playing with where it trails off. And then I was like, all right, so I've got that. Let me just get this enormous head, this enormous head out of my system, just to kind of make sure this is not the direction I want to go. And you can kind of see the challenge that this particular position poses. Challenges that this thing poses, because I'll render the head again, kind of that faceted sort of sharp-edged graphic style, and I'm I'm just kind of roughly figuring out where the webs are going to go. And this is me kind of figuring out how the body position is going to go. And you're going to see right away that I almost have to elongate his legs and have to elongate his body in order to for you to see it at all. Particularly if I pick either that, what did I say, God's eye or Worm's eye? No, Worm's eye. Ah, there you go. Eureka. Worm's eye. That is the one when you're looking at it from below. So if you're under the table and you're shooting your little action figure, looking up, that's the worm's eye point of view. The God's eye point of view is an extremely wide angle, almost like you're above the earth looking down, where you can really see, almost if you're looking at a city, you can kind of see all the streets and all the buildings from an extreme point of view, like a Google map search point of view. And then the bird's eye point of view is lower than that, still above, still looking down on the character, so it creates a different kind of perspective. Aha, I got it. So those are the 3 points of view. I'm glad I was able to rectify that within this video rather than forcing people to scurry to the internet to kind of figure out what the heck I'm talking about. So anyway, so this one's a little more at a basic eye level. And again, I was trying to figure out, all right, what is the pose that I want to get that, is the most iconic, the one that says, Spider-Man Far From Home, however, but in my unique style. And so this is literally like me trying to do my kind of version of what you see on the poster. And then this is me kind of going back to some of the ones that I liked, just kind of cycling through. It's like, none of those are really hitting. So all right, let me get a little more dynamic. I was like, all right, let me really do what they call foreshortening. And what foreshortening is, not to be confused with foreshadowing, foreshortening, and I know I'm going to get this one right, is essentially the act of pushing something in the foreground towards the viewer, kind of tricking the viewer into thinking something's coming out at you, almost coming off the page or off the screen. And I thought, where his head was lunging forward, it might be kind of cool if, and generally when you foreshorten something like this, it's cool to kind of see the legs and arms go back into perspective and the head or hands or something go into the extreme foreground. And oftentimes those elements that are in the extreme foreground will kind of obscure, they'll kind of go over top of the head or the body, and they really get in your face. And I thought that would have been a cool one, but I was like, all right, well, let me try this, another Spider-Man pose, and it kind of wound up looking like what's Aquaman's villain, the Mantis, I think it's called, Black Mantis, I believe. Not much of a DC guy. Love DC characters, but not as knowledgeable. And then, I was like, I don't know about Spider-Man as the Black Mantis. And then I was like, all right, well, maybe let me introduce the web. How about that for a way, Let's try that. Again, the big head, almost pop, Funko Pop proportion, however, with little tiny hands and little tiny feet. And, let me have him kind of swinging up into the web. And I thought it might be a cool composition if it doesn't take up much of the page, like he's smaller in the page. And I think at this point I was like, you know what, all right, I can play around with this, or I can really just, all right, let me just settle in. And I think this is where I finally settle in on the pose that I'm actually going to use to do the finished art, the one that you see in the little thumbnail and the one that you see in the little intro image. This is the Spider-Man pose that I actually finally wound up working with. And so I wanted really long, sort of spindly arms and legs. I wanted the pose to be really extreme. This I would consider in the worm's eye view, to clarify. See how I got that in there? Then pitifully making my errors, but they have been corrected. Worm's eye point of view, meaning looking up at the character, particularly for a character who swings around between buildings in New York City. I think it's kind of cool to see the viewer looking up at him, and that's what he's kind of looking down at you. This is me sort of, I should mention here at this point, I'm working in Procreate on the iPad, and so in Procreate, all of these various little, those little thumbnail sketches, those super loose thumbnail sketches are all on their own layer, including this one. This is probably layer 25 or whatever. As a matter of fact, it's a fun little game. If you want, you guys can go back and watch the video and count all the different variations of Spider-Man I do before I finally settle on this pose. And you can see me here, because it's on its own layer, I can just literally shift the artwork and kind of reposition it. And as you see here, I kind of re-rendered his leg. I thought it looked a little strange. I thought it might be smarter if one leg goes back into perspective and one leg, the leg on the right, kind of comes up. And this is me reducing the size of the head and adjusting the hands. And this is all these adjustments are just made to make it more dynamic. It's really what it's all about. I want that, sort of insect-like feel to his movements. And I want it to be, this is the goal here is not realism. So I'm making the final adjustments here, and before I diminish. And when I say diminish, I just basically take that layer, the layer that has all that sketchy line art, and in Procreate, if you click on the layer palette, there's a little N, and the N stands for normal. If you click on that N, it gives you other layer options, and one of the layer options is you can change the opacity. There's a little slider right there in that layer palette. And that slider, you can slide it down all the way to 0%, and basically you won't see anything at all. Or you can find some percentage between 0 and 100, 100 being obviously fully rendered line, or sketchy line, as in the case may be in this particular layer. And then and you slide it all the way down. I think this is probably, percentage-wise, it's probably somewhere around like 20% opacity. And then once I've locked that in, I just I create a new layer on top, and I select my technical pen brush. Many people have asked in the comment section, what brush do I use? It is not a specialty brush. It's not one that I've designed. It's literally a brush that comes with the basic set in Procreate, in the inking section of your brushes, and it's technical pen. And I just adjusted it. I believe there's a video that I left, I want to say a little less than, certainly a couple of weeks ago, that has that I break down how I actually adjusted the settings to create this brush. And what I like about it is at a lower setting, meaning if this in Procreate, those who know it, there's an option to change the brush size, and at a lower setting on the brush size, I get a really sharp, crisp, thin line. And if I raise it up a bit higher, I can get that nice, thick and thin. And I'm, just to give you a sense, once I've adjusted the brush, and once I've selected the size of it, I'm usually, and by selection I mean usually I'm in the mid on the palette, on the left, or should I say the toolbar, the brush size toolbar. I'm usually around the midway point, maybe just slightly below half. Again, that's kind of an arbitrary number because, if you use the technical pen without it being adjusted, it may change your response. But I like that pen. I'm sure there are better ones out there. I'm sure there are people who have created ones that are like incredibly useful to ink with. But the reality is the inking brush doesn't do the inking. It's the inker. So not very esoteric of me to say, but the reality is it is the inker. If you are the inker, you are the one who has to practice the lines and practice the thicknesses, and sometimes you'll render a line and it's not right, but in Procreate you can double finger tap on the screen and it'll go back a step, makes it basically undoing that previous line. And you may need to do that a dozen times to get the line exactly the smoothness or the angle or the curve or the straight line, whatever it is, to get it the way you want. Not to toot my own horn, but I don't want to brag, but it doesn't take me a lot of lines, a lot of undos, I should say, to capture the line that I'm going for. I may have to go back in and add a little thickness. Generally, I apply the thickness away from wherever the perceived light source is. So if you notice, on Spider-Man right along his jaw, on the right side of his head. There's a thicker line there, and there's a thicker line along his neck there, and his shoulder to the right. Same thing on his fingers in the foreground. There's kind of a thicker line on that forefinger, that pointer finger, in just various areas around there. I just kind of thicken up the lines a bit. And you can see here, again, because it's the Far From Home costume, I added more black. There's an area, there's a little band that cuts across. I believe it's I did it on his forearm. I believe it's just above his elbow, where later on, when I start applying color, it's going to be a little band of red. But along his arms, both arms, you can kind of see it there in his forearms. But the reality is there's black, or should it probably a super deep blue on the actual costume in the movie. So, but I want to indicate that here in black. For me, it's kind of easy. And then, I was kind of adjusting that hand up above. I thought it was a bit too casual. And then, I don't know if you noticed, but I did kind of forget to put the Spider-Man icon on his chest. I want to say, my intent was to kind of go in and do what I'm doing right now by, bringing a reference image of the actual Spider-Man icon on the new, Homecoming and Far From Home, or even, the Avengers movie Spider-Man, that new icon. My intent was to do that and bring it in and then re-render it, but nope, I just flat out forgot and then remembered. I was like, oh, he needs an icon on his chest. So I simply just brought it in, Google image search, brought it in and then re-rendered it, and then on its own layer, I should mention, and then reduced it and put it into position on his chest. And trust me, that logo is going to come back into effect very soon. So color stages, just added new layers, just literally blocked in flat color. It was really easy because Spider-Man is really essentially 3 colors. And then there is that little, well, not so little anymore, that his chest icon. I kind of use it as a background element. And then I chose to kind of add a shadow layer, which again, you just tack a shadow layer on top of the color layer. In this case, I made a selection of the color layer, right? Added a new blank layer on top, and then and while it's still selected, started rendering this shadow. And I rendered it in a dark blue, and with the slightest amount of color in it, not just pure black. And then I reduced the opacity with the way I described it before, by clicking on the layer, hitting the N in the layers palette, and then sliding the opacity slider down till I found a shadow tone I thought would work best for me. And the same thing goes for this highlight. I literally just created a new layer, while it was still selected, and just started rendering in those white lines. And the importance of the selection is because when you render the white, particularly along the edge, like for example along the edge of his head and his fingers, you can go outside of the shape, and it's kind of bound because it's selected. It's the white cannot go beyond the outer line, which is really helpful. Same thing with here, where I'm adding little touches to the webbing. And I was gonna put a highlight there, probably naturally would be there on his leg, but I figured done is done, and that's where I'm at. Done. So Spider-Man, go check out Far From Home. Leave a comment if you like it. Leave a comment if you like this video, please. And sketchyGOichie. Live your moment. Happy sketching, y'all. Peace.